Welcome to Libyth. To understand the Taiheiki, you have to understand the world that made it possible, not as background, not as scenery behind the drama, but as a system under pressure, a set of structural arrangements that were generating their own destruction before any of the named individuals had made a single decision. The catastrophe of the Nanboku-chō period was not caused by bad men or weak emperors or treacherous generals, though the Taiheiki gives us all of those. It was caused by the internal logic of a political order that had been postponing its own contradictions for over a century, and which could not postpone them any longer. To see this clearly, you have to start from the top, from the way authority was organized and legitimized, and follow the pressure downward through every layer of Japanese society until you reach the village, the family, the individual warrior deciding in the middle of a battle which side he is actually on. Authority in Heian and Kamakura, Japan, was not held in one place. It was distributed across a formal system of imperial sovereignty and an actual system of military control. And the relationship between these two systems was not simply that one was real and one was ceremonial. Both were real. Both produced genuine power. The emperor was the source of all legitimate appointment, the ritual center of the cosmos, the descendant of the sun goddess Amaterasu, the figure whose existence sanctified the political order. Without imperial legitimation, no appointment was valid, no law was authoritative, no military force could claim the mandate to do what it did. This was not a fiction that powerful men saw through. It was a framework they operated within, and it constrained them in ways they took seriously. At the same time, the emperor did not command armies. He did not control land. He did not administer provinces, or collect taxes, or supply the organizational infrastructure of governance. That was done by the warrior class, and by the 14th century, specifically by the Kamakura shogunate, and within that structure, by the Hojo clan, who served as regents, that is, as the real decision-makers behind a shogun who was himself already a step removed from the emperor. What this produces is not a stable hierarchy, but a layered instability. The emperor is supreme in legitimacy, but powerless in execution. The shogun commands in practice, but requires imperial sanction to do so. The Hojo regent controls the shogun, but must preserve the fiction of the shogun's authority to preserve his own. Every layer of the system depends on the layer above it for legitimacy and on the layer below it for actual power, and none of the layers has both. This is the architecture of a system that works until it doesn't, that functions as long as everyone agrees to participate in its fictions, and collapses catastrophically the moment someone decides to call the fiction what it is. Emperor Go-Daigo, who enters the Taiheiki as its central driving force, is the man who decided to call the fiction. He was an emperor who actually wanted to rule, who looked at the elaborate machinery of shogunal and regental authority that had accumulated around the imperial institution, and saw it not as the natural order of things, but as an usurpation, a 7-generation theft of authority that rightfully belonged to him. This was not a new complaint. Emperors had chafed under warrior domination before. But Go-Daigo pursued it with an unusual combination of intellectual seriousness, political cunning, and stubborn refusal to accept the constraints of his position. He gathered around him a coalition of court aristocrats, Buddhist monks, and dissatisfied warriors, and he began to plot. The Taiheiki opens in the atmosphere of that plotting, in the mood of a system that knows something is about to break. But the system was already broken before Go-Daigo moved against it. The Kamakura shogunate, by the early 14th century, was suffering from a structural problem that no amount of political skill could solve. It had run out of land to give. The warrior class, the bushi, the samurai, operated on a fundamental economic logic. They provided military service, and in exchange, they received land grants. Land was wealth. Land was status. Land was the material basis of the entire relationship between a lord and his vassals. When the Mongols attacked Japan in 1274 and 1281, Japanese warriors fought, and with the help of typhoons the tradition would later call divine winds, repelled the invasions. But there were no conquered territories to distribute as rewards. The warriors who had fought expected compensation. The Hojo had none to give. This was not a political failure. It was a structural impossibility. The system that sustained samurai loyalty required a continual distribution of land that the shogunate could no longer supply, and there was no mechanism within the system to address this. The loyalty that was supposed to be unconditional was built on an economic logic that the system had exhausted. The effects of this exhaustion radiated outward and downward through every layer of Japanese society. At the level of the great clans, the Hojo, the Ashikaga, the Nitta, the Kusunoki, the collapse of reliable reward created strategic calculation where there should have been loyalty. Warriors who had served the Kamakura shogunate for generations began to consider alternatives. Some of them genuinely believed in Go-Daigo's cause. Others simply concluded that the Hojo were finished and began positioning themselves for whatever came next. The distinction between idealism and opportunism, which the Taiheiki will probe relentlessly, begins here, in the structural conditions that make opportunism rational and loyalty costly. Below the great clans, at the level of provincial warriors and local strongmen, the kokujin, the men of the soil who controlled specific valleys and villages and mountain passes, the dissolution of central authority was even more profound. These men had always occupied an ambiguous position in the formal hierarchy. They owed nominal allegiance to powerful lords, but their actual power derived from local control, from the loyalty of the people who farmed their land and the warriors who served them directly. When the central system weakened, these men did not simply wait to see who would emerge victorious. They calculated. They shifted alliances. They pursued local advantages under the cover of larger political commitments. The Taiheiki is full of these men, warriors who declare for Go-Daigo or for the Hojo or for Ashikaga Takoji based on considerations that have less to do with principle than with proximity, kinship, old grievances, and estimates of who is likely to win. This is the phenomenon the text calls gekokujō, lowers overcoming uppers, and it is important to understand that the Taiheiki does not celebrate it. The world the text values is a world of proper hierarchy, of loyalty flowing upward and protection flowing downward, of each person knowing their place and fulfilling its obligations. Gekokujō is what happens when that world stops working. It is the symptom, not the cure. When a provincial warrior who was supposed to be loyal to a great lord instead betrays him and seizes his land, the Taiheiki registers this as a kind of moral catastrophe, even when the warrior in question is on the side the text favors. The social order is dissolving, and the dissolution is not glorious. It is frightening. It is the sound of the walls coming down. The economic dimension of this dissolution is inseparable from the political. Japan's wealth in this period was organized around the shun system, a network of private estates, many of them owned by court aristocrats or temples or shrines, farmed by peasants who owed dues in grain and labor. The warrior class derived income from their roles as estate managers and protectors, and the revenue they extracted was what allowed them to maintain their equipment, their horses, their retainers. This system was already under strain before the Nanboku-chō conflict began, fragmented by decades of legal disputes, competing ownership claims, and the steady erosion of central authority that could adjudicate between them. When civil war began in earnest, the shun system did not just suffer, it became a battlefield. Rival claimants burned each other's estates. Warriors seized land under the cover of military necessity. The formal legal structures that were supposed to regulate ownership simply ceased to function in many regions. What replaced them was force, and whoever wielded force locally could claim what had once required imperial or shogunal authorization to possess. The family and the clan were the units through which all of this was lived. The samurai house, the ai, was not simply a domestic arrangement. It was a political and military unit, the basic structure through which loyalty was organized and violence was deployed. The ai was held together by hierarchy. The head of the house commanded, the members obeyed, and the obligations were understood as absolute. Sons served fathers. Younger brothers served older brothers. Vassals served lords in a relationship modeled on and extending the logic of the family. Filial piety, the Confucian virtue of loyalty to one's parents, was not a personal sentiment in this world. It was a political technology. It was the ideological glue that held the warrior class together, the principle that made the chain of obligation from the individual fighter to the emperor himself seem natural and necessary rather than constructed and contingent. But when the ai split, when fathers and sons chose different sides, when brothers found themselves in opposing armies, the consequences were not merely personal. They were systemic. The Taiheiki records cases of exactly this kind of fracture. Families divided by the war, the same kinship network producing warriors who fought and killed each other. This is not presented as exceptional tragedy. It is presented as the condition of the age. And it reveals something important about how deeply the political crisis penetrated. It did not stop at the level of great lords and national factions. It reached into the household. It reached into the smallest unit of social organization and forced a choice that the ideology of the age insisted should never have to be made. At the level of the village and the local community, the effects were different but equally destabilizing. The kokujin, local strongmen, were the mediating figures between the great military clans and the farming population that actually produced the wealth. When central authority collapsed, these men became crucial because whoever could secure their loyalty could project power into regions that no great lord could directly control. The kokujin knew this. They used it. They negotiated. They waited. They switched sides when the calculation changed. The Taiheiki is suspicious of them, but it cannot avoid them. They are everywhere in the narrative, because they are the men through whom the war is actually fought on the ground. Without them, the great battles are just two armies in a field. With them, the war is a total condition, penetrating every province, every valley, every community. What all of this produces, by the time the Nanboku-chō conflict is fully underway, is a Japan in which there is no stable center. Not militarily, not politically, not economically, not socially. The formal hierarchy still exists on paper. The emperor still appoints. The shogun still commands. The great lords still expect loyalty from their vassals. But the actual distribution of force, wealth, and decision-making power no longer maps onto the formal structure in any reliable way. The gap between what the system says and what the system does has become so large that individuals at every level are forced to navigate between them, to perform loyalty while calculating advantage, to invoke the old order while operating in the new one. This is the world the Taiheiki is trying to make sense of. This is the system under tension that the book inherits and cannot resolve, because the tension is not a mistake in the system. It is the system. That's all for today on Libyth. One new book every week. At least we try.